morning, everyone, and thank you so much for sharing your time with us this morning to attend this webinar. So, as mentioned, my name is Dr. Megan Weir, and I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Social Impact NSW, and I'm also the lead researcher of the Australian Social Progress Index. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that today I'm on the lands of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people. And one advantage of moving to Zoom meetings this year has meant that I've been able to get more familiar with different countries and custodians where my colleagues and other contacts are living and working. So Isabella, can you introduce yourself and tell us what country or land you're on today?
Thanks, Megan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Isabella Saunders, and I'm a research assistant at CSI, and I've also been one of the primary researchers for the Social Progress Index. Today, I'm on Gadigal land, and I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present.
Thanks, Isa. So one of the things that I've often been saying when doing an acknowledgement of country, when talking about the Social Progress Index, and how I reflect on progress is that often we talk about it with this intent of looking forward to the future that we want. But in order to have a truly progressive society, we also need to be able to look backwards and see where there have been historical injustices for First Nations people in Australia and recognise the ongoing impact that colonisation, including things like the stolen generations, dispossession of land, and decades of stolen wages, has had on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to this day. So we cannot have a progressive society unless we're also willing to confront these uncomfortable histories and disrupt the systems that allow marginalisation and disadvantage to continue. So with that, I would like to pay my respect to elders past and present, both on the land where I am today, but also across Australia, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today. And also to recognise that we are all meeting on land where sovereignty has never been ceded. So for those of you who are less familiar with the Centre for Social Impact, we are a collaboration between the University of New South Wales, Swinburne University of Technology and the University of Western Australia. Put broadly, our aim and purpose is to catalyse positive social change. And this means taking an honest look at our society, where there are disparities and injustices, and our focus is on equipping communities and organisations with the skills to be able to work together for a more equitable society. A major project that at UNSW we are currently undertaking is called the Amplify Social Impact Project, where we aim to help the for-purpose sector better understand our current society, its needs, and its ability to respond to current social issues. And one of those focuses is on economic inequality and its impact on social progress. So Australia, compared to the rest of the world, has been an undeniably economically successful country. So up until the COVID crisis this year, we had seen continuous growth in our gross domestic product, or GDP, over the last 29 years, including relative stability through the global financial crisis of 2007-2008. This means that we have young people who are completing high school and university and entering the workforce in social conditions where there had only ever been growth in their lifetime. The economy, keeping it strong and making policy decisions that first and foremost centre the economy, remains a strong focus, particularly for our government. So when we reflect on last week's budget announcements, spending is largely focused on supporting business and infrastructure to create jobs. Tax cuts to businesses have been passed in order to, and I quote, rebuild our economy and create more jobs by kickstarting activity in the private sector. If we reflect further back into earlier in the year, the government response to the devastation of the bushfires across Australia and Australia's response to climate change more generally has been similar. Any response first and foremost must not jeopardise Australia's vibrant and viable economy. This has also been a strong focus both globally and in Australia as governments respond to COVID, where there are calls to ensure that the economy remains open. But in advocating for this, we have to grapple with the ethical decisions about whether the economy or infection and death rates dictate policy. Australia has done remarkably well overall in its response to COVID by responding quickly with lockdowns and funding primary healthcare. But we're also seeing increasingly that policy priorities are reorienting towards the economy. An issue that more people are becoming aware of is that talking about and focusing on Australia's economy and GDP can feel kind of off when we're dealing with the realities of the communities where there are higher levels of financial stress, homelessness, or untreated illness. There's an issue if we are only talking about GDP per capita and using that as a sole indication that the needs and circumstances of all communities across Australia are therefore progressive. And how we generate an economy and its flow-on effect also matters. So while the economy itself is not a person, it is driven by people within that system. And our work leads us to be critical of assuming that the economy is a benign entity of its own. During the 20th century, and I think still continues to this day to a certain extent, there was an assumption that economic development automatically generated social progress. So if GDP per capita was going up, so was the progressiveness of a society. However, we know that in many instances, economic development doesn't automatically result in social progress. And in some cases, it can even harm it. So a relevant example that I often think of for Australia is the impact of the mining boom, both on the environment, but also its impact on communities where mining companies had resided for a few years and then left once the resources had been fully mined. Other ways of generating income, such as the exportation of arms and the privatization of prisons, undeniably can also have a negative impact on individuals either here or abroad. And this relationship is not necessarily a one-way stream. Sometimes social progress affects economic development. The state of basic education and health in a region could have impacts on how fit and able the workforce is, for example. So in order to truly understand inclusive growth, we need a measure of social progress that is independent of economic measures that we can then correlate against the economy, but it also means that our understanding of the society isn't being muddied by dollar values. So the Amplify Social Impact Project has partnered with the international not-for-profit Social Progress Imperative in creating Australia's first Social Progress Index, or the SPI. The SPI has been calculated at a global level since 2013, and it gives an indication of how countries relative to one another compare on its ability to meet the basic human needs of its citizens, enhance and sustain quality of life, and create conditions for all individuals to reach their full potential. And it's these three domains of basic human needs, foundations of wellbeing and opportunity alongside the economy that we believe will lead to truly inclusive growth. An important part of the index is also that in order for social progress overall to improve, each of these domains must improve. There's no one concept that is more important than the other. A fundamental argument then is that when we think about responding to crises such as COVID-19, we can't think of it solely as an economic crisis or only as a health crisis, but instead need to be thinking about how we respond to an intersecting and complex system of economic, health, and social problems. For a resilient and inclusive recovery, we would also be wanting to hit each of these four domains to ensure sustainable building blocks are there that allow us to use the structures of an inclusive economy and society that can also help us better prepare to respond to crises in the future.
So the Social Progress Index offers us an accessible and actionable assessment of the health of society that is completely independent of economic measures. It's a framework that aims to capture not just present challenges and today's priorities, but also the challenges that countries or regions will face as their economic prosperity rises. The index reveals relative performance compared to a region's economic peers, and then assesses their success in turning economic progress into improved social outcomes. So the SPI is distinct from other tools in that it includes only social and environmental indicators, and it also just measures outcomes instead of inputs. So this means that we were less interested in, for example, when we were creating our Australian Social Progress Index, how much money was spent on a campaign to enrol more children in preschool, but instead we were more focused on the proportion of children who actually ended up in preschool. So the index offers what we call universally important questions. So these are concerns that are relevant to any country, state, or territory, and any indicator that we included in the Australian Social Progress Index needed to be aimed at addressing one of these questions. So over the last 18 months, we've been going through a process of consultation with academics, members of the for-purpose sector, businesses invested in the Sustainable Development Goals, and also local government to really think about what we can use as indicators to best answer these questions for Australia. It wasn't just a question of what indicators we should include, but it was also a process of working out what data was actually available in Australia. So we needed to use data sources and indicators that were being consistently measured across all 8 states and territories, and also data sources that were updated annually. So this ended up turning into a bigger challenge than we initially expected. So this process of identifying the indicators that were available and then also setting the limits of what we thought would be the best and the worst case scenarios for Australia's social progress led us to this that you see here. So this image shows how Australia's states and territories are performing relative to one another on overall social progress. This is the one for 2018. It is important to make clear that these scores are how socially progressive the society and its policies are, not the people that live there. So we were able to calculate the SPI scores between 2015 and 2018 annually. And then we also ranked the states and territories on both overall social progress, but also on each domain and component within the SPI framework. So as a brief overview on the scores, between 2015 and 2018, we did see some consistent trends. So ACT was consistently the #1 region each year, and then New South Wales ranked either second or third across all the years, but it ended on second there in 2018. So on the other end, Western Australia and Northern Territory consistently placed 7th and 8th respectively. So also just to briefly note, these scores are for the state or territory as a whole. So in the future, we will hopefully be able to calculate the index on things that reflect, for example, remoteness or cultural and religious differences or experiences of people with a disability, for example. So each day this week, during this series of webinars, we've been focusing on a different state or territory and exploring their SPI scores. So as we mentioned, today is New South Wales and ACT. So we'll be doing a deep dive into these states' scorecards, also where they ranked compared to other states and territories. And we've also mapped each state's performance with their policy responses to COVID to see where there are existing vulnerabilities and also how the state government has responded during the pandemic. We will also cover how the SPI relates to the Sustainable Development Goals and how these different states and territories are progressing towards achieving those goals. So to understand these scorecards a bit better, we'll also zero in on some of the indicators that we actually used to make up these SPI scores. And we'll talk about what we can take away from both the index findings, but then also where we see a need for improvement in line with the SDGs. So when you think about ACT and New South Wales, how would you describe these states? So feel free to put in the chat there how you would describe ACT or New South Wales, whether you live there or whether you're an outsider to the state, just kind of describing your general perception of those areas. So we did a quick whip around our office and came up with a couple of these descriptions. So people obviously see the ACT as Australia's capital, also that it's got a high proportion of public servants. And New South Wales is generally kind of seen as the most diverse. It's got a big mix of both metro and urban, kind of having the business capital of Australia, but then there's also some remote and very remote areas. New South Wales is also the most populous state. So these are the kind of general impressions that we have as both outsiders and those living in these states. And it's really been an interesting process of aligning these perceptions of a place that we have against the scores and the data that we ended up seeing from the SPI. So when we look at how New South Wales performed on the most recent SPI, it scored second of the 8 states and territories, which was pretty consistent with the previous years. So from these scores, you can see that there were lower scores on shelter, environmental quality and inclusiveness, but there were also some higher scores on water, sanitation, nutrition and basic medical care, and also on personal rights. Now looking at ACT's overall scores from 2018, as mentioned, ACT consistently scored first across the country on overall social progress, but it did have particularly high performance in access to basic knowledge, personal rights, and also access to advanced education. However, there were some lower scoring components as well, mostly in the opportunity domain. So these included components like personal freedom and choice and inclusiveness. We will go into these high and low performing areas a little more in depth later on.
So while the scores give us an insight into how a state and territory is performing relative to all other states and territories in Australia, the other thing that we can layer to this analysis is an understanding of how an individual state or territory is performing in the individual components of social progress relative to what we call its economic peers. And this is relevant because of that two-way stream with economic and social progress. So it's not reasonable for us to assume that less wealthy jurisdictions are able to commit the same resources to policy as wealthier areas. So these scorecards help us to understand how a state or territory is performing on elements of social progress relative to its four closest states or territories in terms of its gross state product per capita, which is a more localized version of GDP. The shading on the scorecards that you see indicates performance. So a yellow button indicates a score within one standard deviation of its peers and indicates that they're performing within the expected range for that component. Green is a score that is greater than one standard deviation than its peers and indicates performance that is better than expected. And red is for a score that is more than one standard deviation worse and indicates performance that is worse than expected. So when thinking about the ideal scorecards, it's not possible for every state to be performing better than its peers and to be green all over. But ideally, what we would like to have in the future is to get to a point where all scores for everyone is yellow and they're all performing within their expected range. If we look at New South Wales' scorecard, on overall social progress, it was performing better than its economic peers. And this is particularly the case for basic human needs, specifically for nutrition and basic medical care, and also water and sanitation, and then for opportunity overall. It's performing within the expected range for all other components of the framework. When we're looking at the ACT's performance compared to its economic peers, it's unsurprisingly overperforming both in overall social progress, as well as all of its underlying domains. There were no components where there was underperformance, rather that the ACT was performing within the expected range for nutrition and basic medical care, health and wellness, and personal freedom and choice, and everything else it was overperforming. So we released the index in February this year with this intention of engaging with individual states and territory governments to discuss how the SPI can be used as a way of determining policy priorities and addressing areas of social progress that were found to be particular vulnerabilities based on their scores and the scorecards. But like a lot of things this year, the plan got interrupted when COVID became a bigger threat in Australia, and we shifted to working remotely, as well as government and university priorities significantly shifting in a short period of time. One thing that we did notice, however, is that it can be really difficult to understand and interpret various policies and stimulus packages when they're being released almost daily. But what we did find was that the SPI framework actually became a really useful way of understanding and interpreting what was receiving attention and was being understood as the big issues of COVID. So we went through this process of making an assumption. First off, I should flag, is we made two. So the first assumption being that where a government chooses to spend its money is indicative of where it places its priorities. And the second is that we should conservatively expect that without targeted policy attention, any pre-existing inequalities are also likely to deepen when going into a period of crisis such as a pandemic. So what we did then was look at each policy or stimulus package that was announced both by state or territory and also federal governments, and judged whether that policy fit within a particular component of the Social Progress Index framework, or whether it was a measure that was focused only on the economy or employment. And this mapping could go both ways. So policies could be aiming to target a particular social issue, such as increased funding for homelessness services, but also on-the-spot fines have potential risk for personal rights if they're handed out in ways that target particular groups of people that have historically been disproportionately policed. So we'd note here that this analysis isn't intended to reveal how well a government is responding to COVID, but instead it gives us an insight into where policy priorities are being concentrated or require more attention. And the analysis that we're talking through today is based on a fact sheet that we published first in about July, and then we released an updated version earlier this week. And the link to the full paper, I believe Rhonda is going to add to the comments. And it's a living document that we're updating about fortnightly at this stage with new policies as they're announced.
So in looking at New South Wales COVID response, largely New South Wales rated as performing in general within or above the expected ranges in all the components of the SPI framework, which we mentioned earlier. And the investments here during the COVID response are relatively consistent with those scores. However, there were things like fast tracking or increasing the amount of mining as a way of boosting the economy, which may have a negative impact on future social progress for the state. So much of New South Wales' funding response was focused around economic investment, such as tax cuts and employment packages. So because of this, New South Wales was probably the most aligned to the general federal policy response to COVID. And there was a clear lack of funding focused on personal safety or personal freedom and choice. So similar to other states as well, New South Wales also implemented, as Megan mentioned, on-the-spot fines for individuals breaching public health orders. So this does have the potential to disproportionately target already marginalised groups. New South Wales did have some policy wins though. So for example, there was a large $73 million mental health service boost and also a $700 million boost in ICU expansion and also additional support for temporary visa holders. Now looking at ACT's response, ACT had one of the lower direct economic investments of all the states and territories, but that probably is influenced by things like the size of the state and also the fact that a high proportion living in the state are in Australian public service, so potentially in less precarious employment. As we mentioned previously, the ACT did score highly across many aspects of the SPI compared to other states and territories. This demonstrates the fact that we can't directly compare spendings between states and territories, but instead we need to contextualise what investment looks like in response to vulnerability. ACT has had a relatively strong investment into social support, such as homelessness and domestic violence funding, and also mental health support. And while the ACT has had significantly lower cases of COVID than its other eastern state neighbours, we would assume that this broad policy response across many areas of social progress would hopefully protect the ACT from potentially increasing those vulnerabilities. So another new application of the Australian SPI that we can show today is using the Australian SPI scores to give an indication of how each state and territory is progressing towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, known as the SDGs. So for those who are not familiar with the SDGs, they are a set of 17 integrated goals that were adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015 as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and also ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by the year 2030. They were originally created as a replacement to the Millennium Development Goals that set out to respond to and tackle global indignity and poverty. So Australia is a signatory to the goals. However, there are two recognised issues in Australia. So the first being that much of the focus has been on Australia assisting in implementing these goals in developing countries, particularly in the Pacific region, but there hasn't been much recognition given to the fact that we also need to ensure the goals are being met within Australia. Secondly, there's also no clear strategy towards measuring or reporting on goal attainment. So as a consequence, these goals can be seen as something that people can really get behind, but there isn't really a way of measuring that's being put in place to track how Australia is actually progressing towards meeting the goals. So the Social Progress Index framework was developed with the SDGs in mind so that the components can be used to give us an insight into how each state and territory is actually progressing on the SDGs using a proxy measure.
So when we say proxy, we do so recognising that these scorecard indicators are based on what data is currently available and what data was appropriate for the SPI methodology. And the scores are derived by calculating the average of all the component scores that were judged to contribute to a particular goal. However, this is definitely a first in terms of getting a comparative measure of how states and territories are progressing towards achieving the goals. And similar to the economic peer scorecards, can give an insight into areas where there is more attention needed as a matter of policy priority. There's a lot to take in on these scorecards, and I know that for many of you, this is probably on quite a small screen. So instead at this stage, what we'll do is dive into some of the higher scoring and lower scoring goals and talk about what this means when aiming for sustainable social progress. So looking at the highest scoring goals for New South Wales, these were goals 2 and 7. So goal 2 being zero hunger, aims to end hunger and achieve food security, as well as improving sustainable agricultural practices. And goal 3, good health and wellbeing, aims to ensure healthy lives and promote wellbeing for people of all ages. So the way that we created proxy scores for goal 2 primarily centered around access to nutrition and basic medical care, and also shelter. So for achieving zero hunger, indicators that could be used to understand how New South Wales is going in achieving this goal is by looking at things like infant mortality and premature mortality rates, but also through things like cardiovascular mortality. And so remember that the SPI is measured based on outcome indicators. So when we're thinking about these scores, we're considering whether the indicators are a possible outcome of, for example, a lack of adequate nutrition. Good health and wellbeing also included components such as health and wellness, water and sanitation, and personal safety as matters contributing to wellness. For New South Wales, there were lower levels of waterborne illnesses and infant mortality, and then also good rates of community mental health treatment. Looking at the lower scoring goals, for New South Wales, these were goals 9 and 15. So 9 is to develop quality, reliable, sustainable and resilient infrastructure, including regional and trans-border infrastructure. And goal 15 is that by 2020, we ensure that the conservation, restoration and sustainable use of terrestrial and inland fresh water ecosystems. So at the moment, these are 2 of the goals that we would suggest that New South Wales needs to be paying targeted attention to. So if we're looking at how New South Wales is faring at achieving industry, innovation and infrastructure, we looked at components that included things like access to advanced education and also access to communication and information. And New South Wales had lower scoring indicators on these, such as the estimated homelessness rate as a measure of infrastructure, high school retention rate, and feelings of safety on public transport. And then for goal 15, we looked at environmental indicators. I would note, however, that the environmental indicators across Australia were quite complicated for us when we were looking for indicators to include. So when we're searching for nationally consistent indicators, what we could use to meaningfully contribute to understandings of environmental quality, when we were looking for those, we found that many states hadn't actually been updating their air quality index publicly, for example, in the timeframe that we were looking for, although New South Wales was. So this means that we need to be substituting in scores for some states or using what is available as data as sort of a proxy measure and estimation of what environmental quality looks like. And so this is giving us an understanding of maybe environment is an issue for New South Wales at the moment, but until we get consistent measurement across the country, particularly if we're wanting to understand how we're progressing towards achieving the SDGs, we need to be investing in that data collection so that we can get a good understanding of where there needs to be progress. And it's really difficult to do that if we don't have the data to direct our attentions.
So here are ACT scores for each SPI component mapped onto the Sustainable Development Goals. So as you can see, in general, ACT is performing well across all the goals, and all scores were in the second highest quintile range. 2 highest scoring goals, though, for ACT were goals 4 and 1. So goal 4, which is quality education, is the goal that aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning. And the goal 1 of no poverty is pretty straightforward. So this goal in particular is a direct descendant of the Millennium Development Goals. While poverty is undeniably linked with the economy, which the SPI doesn't include, there are ways of measuring the impact of poverty through components such as health and shelter. So looking first at the high score for quality education, we used indicators as proxy measures from the SPI components of access to basic knowledge and also access to advanced education. So the ACT scored particularly well here, especially in terms of gender parity in higher education and also high school retention rates. To calculate the score for no poverty, as I mentioned, we use scores from the SPI components of shelter, health, and then also personal rights. So ACT scored above its economic peers in many of these indicators, most notably in the rates of overcrowding, teen pregnancy rates, and also infant and premature mortality rates. So now looking at some of the lower scoring SDG scores for the ACT, these include decent work and economic growth and gender equality. So note that these are still proxy scores of the SDGs that scored very well, but they're just 2 of the lowest scoring goals for ACT. So goal 8, decent work and economic growth, is focused on promoting sustained, inclusive and sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth. And goal 5 is focused on gender equality, so achieving equality and empowering all girls and women. So for goal 8, decent work and economic growth, we use the components of access to information and communication and also inclusiveness. So similarly for gender equality, we use the SPI components of inclusiveness, then also personal freedom and choice. So it was in these components where we saw ACT performing a little lower. While they were still in the expected range, they were lower compared to the other scores for ACT. So in particular, some of the lower scores were components that included digital access and affordability, and also the gender employment gaps. So this includes both the gender ratio in underemployment and then also in the gender pay gap. So gender equality, especially when being considered in relation to employment, is therefore an area that maybe the ACT should be paying targeted attention to. Also, during a time such as COVID, where women are disproportionately responsible for caring for families, this barrier to gender equality could definitely be amplified. We also saw in the ACT lower scores for Indigenous disparity. So this was both in terms of the numbers of children in out-of-home care and also the number of children who were subject to abuse substantiations.
So an important thing to talk about when we talk about the index scores and the scorecards is to acknowledge and recognise that there's this inherent tension that kind of exists between our perception of a state or territory and the data. So one thing that we noticed when we were talking about perceptions of a state or territory, thinking back to what Isabella was talking about earlier and our whip around the office, is that we're often really actually describing a capital city or the areas that we know and in our experience as representative of the entire jurisdiction, but that perception doesn't necessarily reflect what life is like, for example, out in Walgett or in Dubbo in New South Wales. And this links to a second point, that location matters. So due to data availability at this stage, we were only able to calculate an Australian SPI at a state and territory level, which inevitably led to what we call a smoothing effect. So you're seeing averages across the entire jurisdiction, rather than being able to detect nuance that exists between metro and remote areas. This is a definite goal that we have with moving the SPI forward. And we want to be able to invest in data collection and measurement so we can start seeing how different local communities across Australia are faring on social progress. The other thing to note with the SPI scores is that each score is how a jurisdiction is performing relative to all other states and territories in Australia. So this means that there may be instances where there is area for improvement in the ACT, for example, on things like social housing or gender equity. But based on the available data, there are other jurisdictions that are having greater issues in delivering good policies and services that meet those needs. Another important point for me that I want to be able to express is that we often talk about data as if it's this apolitical or neutral tool. But what we measure and how we measure it actually really matters. So if we don't measure the impact of a social problem, it's really easy to say that it doesn't exist. And similarly, how we phrase a survey question or the way that we present data contributes to particular narratives and interpretations, which then guides policy and decision making. And I'm definitely not trying to say that the SPI is not part of this, but instead I'm encouraging within myself and also others who use and talk about the SPI to be willing to critique how it is that we collect data and through discussion, identify priorities or gaps in data collection and advocate for that to change in the future. Finally, an SPI score is an indication of the socially progressiveness of the policies and structures within the ACT and New South Wales, not the people living within it. And it's also the case that individual lived experience may be vastly different to the picture being painted by the SPI scores. We don't want to invalidate those experiences, but instead it's our hope that we can be using the SPI framework as a way of understanding how basic needs and foundations for well-being and opportunity are not being met, and together work towards solutions for better policy and decision making.
So in summing up, if we're looking at where there is cause for celebration within these jurisdictions, both from the SPI and in the SDG scorecards, firstly, both New South Wales and ACT are scoring overall quite well across the board. New South Wales is performing above its peers for many of the components of basic human needs, so that includes access to adequate nutrition and basic medical care. The state also performed slightly better than its peers in the opportunity domain. So that's looking at things like inclusiveness and personal rights. New South Wales was also one of the states to have the greatest improvement across the years of 2015 to 2018 in overall social progress. Then looking at ACT, as mentioned, ACT consistently scored #1 in the country on overall social progress and also in many of the components. In particular, the state performed really well on the education components, including the high school retention rate. It also consistently scored well on basic human needs as well as on personal rights. So these high scores across the board means that ACT appears to be doing well in its progression towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. However, despite the generally good scores for these two states, when we consider the scorecards and SDG progress, we also see areas of vulnerabilities. So in particular, New South Wales shows underperformance in shelter and environmental quality. Also, homelessness in New South Wales is a clear issue, which we have seen frequently in recent times, with crisis accommodation hitting capacity and an urgent need for more affordable and social housing across the state. And then for ACT, there was also underperformance in Indigenous disparities of children in out-of-home care and abuse substantiations. ACT also scored lower than its peers on gender employment indicators, suggesting that there is a need to prioritise equality in the workplace. This is an example of how we also need to consider how the impact of underperformance in one area of social progress, such as the gender pay gap, can then have flow-on effects to other areas of social progress, such as access to shelter or personal safety. So, for example, if a woman is in insecure work and being paid less, she may be less likely to leave an abusive relationship, for example. As we mentioned earlier, the SPI framework isn't intended to be considered as siloed issues or focuses, but instead decision-making needs to consider how these components of overall social progress work in tandem to be able to improve access and equity for everyone.
So we want the SBI to be a tool that can help inform better policy. As I've mentioned, it can function as a tool to give insight into where there are areas of social progress that are flourishing for particular jurisdictions. And by using a standardised measure where states and territories can be compared, we can better demonstrate where outcomes are quantifiably improving societies. And we believe that everyone can find a component within the SPI that best represents their cause. If you're a Minister for Education, for example, looking at access to both basic and advanced educations in Australia should help to identify where there are opportunities for development. It also encourages collaboration. So we want this to be a tool that can help governments to partner with the not-for-profit and for-purpose sector to partner on shared causes as represented by components of the index and to help identify opportunities to work together to achieve common goals. The first Australian SPI provides the beginning of a conversation about how we could measure social progress within Australia. As a first step, it is a tool that is using the best available data to demonstrate the extent to which basic human needs, foundations of wellbeing and opportunity are playing out across Australia's states and territories. It helps us to shift our attention away solely from economic growth indicators as measures of progress, but instead start talking about progress in terms of inclusive growth. Looking into the future, there are a lot of ways that we can use the Social Progress Index to look deeper into Australia's progress towards achieving these basic human needs foundations of wellbeing and opportunity for the people that live here. So at a more local level, for example, we could calculate a sub-state SPI. So for example, we could do a New South Wales Social Progress Index, but we drill down to more granular data that is using indicators that have been determined within New South Wales to best reflect what we want to have as a socially progressive society. Ideally, we would love to create a national SPI at a local government level, which would allow us to compare the scores across these smaller regions and provide greater insight into exactly where in Australia things are progressing well and where they are not, and on which components. In particular, it would allow us to compare between metro and rural areas, which we know can differ greatly in their levels of social progress, but unfortunately cannot be disaggregated in our current Australian SPI. And so while a lack of data at this level currently makes calculating a local government index difficult, another option is to create a framework only. And this has actually been done in Reykjavik in Iceland. And what we do here is map different indicators that align to the SPI components, but aren't necessarily currently being collected consistently across the country. But we would do this through community consultation to have a voice into what the ideal socially progressive society looks like for Australia. And we see this community engagement as an important factor in each of these steps, where we would want to be making sure that we're including community voices on what social progress means to them, what is important, and where we're planning to go as a society. And that's really what these webinars have been aimed at doing this week, is getting the word out about the Social Progress Index and looking more directly at individual states and territories. So we very much welcome questions and thoughts about that now. And yeah, I might pass back to you, Rhonda, but thank you very much everyone for your time today.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Megan and Isabella. Yeah, we've got a few questions that have come through, which is great. I've got a few of my own, as always. So we'll just do some questions up till 12:30. But if you do have any others, please pop them in the chat feed. We'd be happy to get to them. We get asked this one quite a bit around the accessibility of the framework of indicators. Is it publicly accessible, and where can people access it?
Yes, so the methodology report is available online. It's all publicly accessible. So that shows the framework and all of the indicators that we used to measure each component, and also the data sources that where that data came from. So that report is available on the CSI SPI website, which Rhonda has put in the chat.
I have indeed. And I will also share it in our follow-up email with the recordings of our webinars this week. Yeah, so I'll add some links and other resources which will be useful, I'm sure.
Thanks, Rhonda.
This is an interesting question. Are there any indicators related to biodiversity, i.e. threatened extinction rates of species or percentage loss of critical habitat?
This is a really good question, and short answer is no. And it was a really difficult one for us to kind of navigate and work out how we could best represent environmental quality in Australia based on what indicators are available. One of the challenges we found was that there is inconsistent data collection that's occurring, particularly broken down at the state and territory level, or it had kind of been done once in 2013 but hadn't been updated since, and so therefore it didn't kind of meet the requirements of the methodology. So yeah, with the environmental quality component, we included, I think it was about 3 measures of the air quality index, and then also water stress, which is kind of based on some geo mapping, kind of led by Google Maps and things like that. So there's some cool stuff happening with that geo mapping work. There's also another one that they do on tree loss. And I think that's a potential future for things about, the percentage loss of critical habitat. But I think until we get good definitions of what that looks like in Australia, that's also going to be really difficult to measure, and also recognizing that we're not environmental experts, so we definitely need to kind of engage in that consultation and discussion of what that looks like more as well.
Another question I've got, which is actually relates to what you just said. What are some of the indicators that you would like to add but you don't currently have data sources available, and would you look into conducting your own research in order to add this indicator? Why or why not?
Do you want to go first, Issa, or will I?
Sure, I'll go. And then you can add to my answer.
Okay.
So obviously, as Megan mentioned, environmental data is a big one, but there were also some gaps that we found, particularly in the opportunity domain, around experiences of marginalised people, so experiences of racism, for example. That was something that we really wanted to include in the SPI that would have been really useful, but unfortunately isn't being collected consistently across the country. So that is something that we're really keen in the future, particularly partnering with organisations or having some kind of consultation in getting that data collected, not necessarily us collecting it ourselves, but working with other people to maybe fund that data collection in the future.
Yeah, so when we went through this process of determining the indicators that were included in the SPI, we looked at, I think it was over 450 potential indicators and data sources. And so we got like a pretty good insight into what data is currently being collected and is available. And there are some really great, surveys that are being done on inclusiveness, but the sample size was just that we couldn't, include it because it was too small. And so rather than us trying to kind of reinvent the wheel and create our own measuring of inclusion, we would say that it's better in the future to kind of be partnering with those organizations and, you know, advocating for them to get their sample sizes boosted. Yeah, I think we're very good in Australia at collecting administrative data. And so that's around, you know, standardized death rates. And, you know, we had no problem getting information on prison, like imprisonment and, you know, assaults and things like that. But yeah, it was definitely on those kind of slippery concepts around, you know, how is it that you measure personal freedom and choice, that it was trickier. And so I think to that last point of having that ongoing community consultation in sort of saying, you know, how is it that you would measure, or what is it that contributes to this idea of personal freedom and choice, and what can we do in the longer term in terms of planning for measuring that and getting a structure in place to do that.
Great, thank you. That was a great question. Isabella, and the person who asked it said thank you. She just messaged me privately. So Isabella, I will ask this one of you. What was the most surprising or unexpected result for you for New South Wales and ACT?
I mean, I wasn't on the whole too surprised, I guess, that ACT and New South Wales were the highest scoring overall on social progress. But within ACT, looking deeper into the scores on components and individual indicators, I think I was most surprised by ACT's lowest scores on those Indigenous disparity indicators. So the rate ratio between Indigenous young people in out-of-home care compared to non-Indigenous, and then also abuse substantiation rates for Indigenous compared to non-Indigenous. And I think that was just surprising to me, considering how well ACT does on basic human needs and foundations of well-being. And it just kind of, I guess, made me reflect on the fact that scoring well on basic human needs doesn't automatically flow into a high score on opportunity. And there's still definitely vulnerabilities within ACT to focus on those areas. Yeah, that was probably the most surprising thing for me. How about you, Megan?
I think I was surprised that New South Wales scored as well as it did on shelter. And this is something that we've had a few people upset with us about, actually, that New South Wales, you know, it wasn't dead last. And that kind of goes back to that point of what I was saying, like, you know, an index is only as good as the data that you include, and also kind of matching up that perception with what the data is saying, and not saying that one is more right than the other. But, you know, recognizing that definitely for the estimated homelessness rate, that was something that New South Wales was underperforming on. But, you know, in sort of a measure of general overcrowding, not social housing overcrowding, New South Wales was doing okay. So I think that was surprising, just how that score came through. And I think it is just what we try to be really delicate with in terms of navigating that line between saying, you know, well, this is what a score is, a number is useful because it helps you compare, but also there's a certain degree of interpretation that goes in with that. And so that's something we've been really tried to be really careful around, but also recognizing that, yeah, like, just because you seem to have a good score at the moment on something like shelter doesn't mean that it's not something you can improve on. And I think that's definitely where the more localized versions of SBI can come in handy as well.
Definitely. Everything is pointing to that. I've got a question here which relates to the point really of the SBI and the future of it. So maybe we could wrap it all together. So someone has asked, is the intention to use this framework to help the federal government track national progress on the SDGs?
That's a really good question. Thank you for that. And look, we're still working on the strategy for that. We have started doing some consultations one-on-one with MPs, just talking about the SPI and particularly the SDG scorecards, and there's been some interest around that. I think it's coming from a recognition that, you know, when it is, as Isabella mentioned earlier, we're not great at measuring how it is that we're going towards achieving the SDGs, or, you know, the Department of Federal Affairs and Trading has kind of like the web platform where it's looking at all the different indicators of achieving the SDGs, but they're not necessarily identifying, you know, where there's areas of underperformance, particularly within states and territories. We're definitely not wanting to say that we're going to be the leaders on that and that we're the only ones doing it, because there's other groups, particularly sort of, you know, the Monash Sustainable Development Institute, that are doing really great work on the SDGs. And so we're offering the SPI as a way of conceptualizing it. It definitely doesn't need to be the only framework, but in terms of, you know, if people are responding to numbers and scores, then this is one way of potentially being able to do it. But yeah, I would say that the SDG kind of component of this work is relatively new, and it's something that we are offering up, but it's definitely open to consultation. And we're also sort of working with the International Social Progress Imperative on what their strategy around it is as well.
Mm-hmm. And just to stress, it's a completely publicly accessible and free tool.
Yes.
I would love anyone to use.
Yes.
Just on that, someone has asked, are you providing training on how to use the SPI to avoid the misunderstandings around the data, which you've talked about in your presentation?
I'll go if you would like, Megan. So I haven't thought of it before in kind of the sense of training necessarily, but up until this point, I suppose what we have seen as being really important throughout our communication of the SPI is just being really transparent about those potential issues and, you know, potential misinterpretation or misunderstanding of data, and also just the weaknesses or the gaps in data that we have. So I think that's, up until this point, the way that we've mostly been kind of navigating that potential issue, is just making sure that our methodology is completely transparent, that we have, you know, in the report that I mentioned earlier, we've outlined the way that we calculated everything, all the places that we had to input data, for example. But yeah, definitely specific training might be a good idea as well. What do you think, Megan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's been the really great thing about these webinars, and thank you, Rhonda, for organising them. We did one earlier in the year that definitely did go more in depth into the SPI and the methodology itself. And it's that tricky balance of, you know, wanting to get something that's quick and across, like, that people can get really easily. And we feel this tension, I think, when we're talking about the SPI, where it's like, it's great and accessible, but you have to think about these things. And so, you know, how do you weave the two in together? So I think we kind of view it as a bit of a personal responsibility to kind of be making those caveats clear when we're talking about this. And so that's why we have kind of those points throughout the presentation that are about, you know, just stop and think about this thing for a minute. And yeah, I think that just helps us with our own reflection on how it is that we're contributing to this index and what messages it is being used to kind of portray.
Yeah, maybe we'll do a video where it is the training style video and we can record it.
Oh, yeah, how to use the
But that other webinar, I'll also send it in my email. It was a great one. It was in April, a little more in depth overall. So I think I just will wrap up. I just wondered if there's anything else you wanted to say around the future of the SPI and where you're hoping it's headed.
I think it's got a really exciting potential for, as we mentioned, this collaboration between, you know, what are corporate social responsibility or other philanthropic funders, you know, wanting to contribute to something in understanding what our current society looks like, but then also using that as an opportunity to work with people that are actually working across the sector. And so they are conversations that we're starting to have. There's some local governments that are starting to get interested as well. So that is really great. So I think it's sort of about, you know, getting it as a language is one of the first priorities, and then also advocating for better data collection is probably sort of the secondary academic intention with that. But yeah, we're definitely having some conversations, and we're intending to update the SPI next year as well, so that will include the 2019-2020 scores. So there will be more coming.
Yeah, there will be. And Megan and Isabella are happy to chat with anyone who has more interest. And I will share their details in that email as well. It's going to be one big email. Great. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Megan and Isabella. I can't thank you enough for this week-long series, for all the work that you put into the presentations and your knowledge and your insight. I really appreciate it as your colleague, and I'm sure everyone else does. As I said, I will send the recording next week, and I encourage everyone to check out impact2020.online for other Impact 2020 webinars we're running. We usually run them monthly, and we've got some interesting ones coming up for November, and December is yet to be announced. And I'm working on Impact 2021, so it will continue. I'll wrap it up there and thank everyone for attending, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
See you.
Bye-bye.